We're very excited to have Diana Butler Bass with us tonight. Diana is a prolific writer and scholar, and she is someone who is able to help us understand some of the dynamics that we're dealing with in our faith walk and interpret it in a way that brings it with a winsome and reflective voice. We're very grateful to have her. She holds a PhD in religious studies from Duke University. And hopefully the United Methodist stuff has not rubbed off on you too much. But we're just happy to have you today. I'm going to just offer also and say to you as we, by way of welcoming you to our gathering, if there are any needs that you have, we have restrooms downstairs. We have one on this level that's available to you, kind of unisex. If you go out that door to my left, in the back of the sanctuary, that's available to you, but the others are, the men's room is on that side and the women's is on the left side down the stairs. So we ask that you would also join us after the presentation today for the book signing that will take place out there in the narthex, and then downstairs we will have some refreshments, so we hope to have you join us for that as well. Let us pray. Great, gracious and eternal God, we thank you for all of the things that you do in our lives and for the ability to be grateful for what you have done for each one of us. We thank you for safe travel for Diana Butler Bass, and we ask that you would use her in a mighty way this evening. We ask this in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening. Thank you for coming out. Gosh, it's been a beautiful few days, hasn't it been? I think we're looking forward, though, to some thunderstorms tomorrow. So, well, before we get started, it is one of those things in our culture now when it's very helpful for me to remind you that you carry around one of these in your pockets and to make sure that the sound is muted or on vibrate. I will never forget the time when I was with a group of Lutheran ministers in Nebraska, and we were talking about the Christian practice of dying well. It was an incredibly heavy, very serious afternoon, and one of the minister's cell phones went off, and his ringtone was, "Do a little dance, make a little love, get down tonight." I don't know what happened to that guy, but somebody told me he got sent to Manitoba by his bishop. So you don't want to be that person. So other than that, we have a good evening ahead of us. I hope that you will find this material and the new book that I've written something that is as beautiful and challenging and relevant as I have in the last couple of years. Grateful is actually my 10th book. I can hardly believe that. When my mom passed away, she passed away in 2010, I had written 8 books. And I remember that year before she got really sick, she said to me, "You know, Diana, if you'd lived in the 19th century, you'd have 8 children and 1 book." Instead of the opposite way around. I actually have 2 kids. It's been quite an interesting and amazing, eventful last month for us. My stepson, who is going to be 30 this year, which I can hardly believe, just got engaged. Isn't that exciting? And then my daughter, who is a student at the University of Virginia, is studying at the University of Edinburgh this semester. So she's been tracking Brexit for you all, making sure that they stay, going in the straight and narrow path there. And I actually live outside of Alexandria, or outside of Washington, D.C. in Alexandria, Virginia. And so my life is shaped in many ways by being around millennials, by listening quite a bit to political and social issues that are in the air. My husband works at a Methodist church, so do we have any other Methodists here? Okay, just you. There's a couple of you. Okay, they don't want to put their hands up too high because they're all like sad and stressed right now because their denomination's going through some stuff. And I happen to be an Episcopalian. And so that's just, I think, some helpful information so you know a little bit about where I'm located and things I care about. And that I've written 10 books, but I'm an incredibly regular person. So this book, Grateful, number 10, is in many ways a very different project than the 9 books that came before it. My first book, of course, was my doctoral dissertation. And then I wrote a number of books which were about congregations. I got really interested in the question of why it is that some congregations seem to grow when other ones were declining. And the typical way that that question had been answered before I began writing this big, long string of books is that several scholars a long time ago, in the 1970s, had said that congregations grow or decline on the basis of their theological opinions. That is, liberal congregations were declining and conservative theological congregations were growing. And I was never satisfied with that answer, and so I started really a decade's worth of research to see if that was really true. And what I discovered in all that research and the many books that I wrote around those subjects is that it really isn't so much about theology, but it is about disposition. It's about what we take seriously as people. It's about whether or not we practice our faith with authenticity and real passion. It's about how we connect to God and one another. And it's really about, right now at least, being able to communicate with communities around us of a living, vibrant experience of the divine in our own lives and how that matters and how it changes us and the world. Now, while I was working on all of those books, something very interesting began to happen, and that is all of these surveys and data started coming back in from any number of different places, and they were all saying the same thing, and that is religion overall was in a state of decline. When I started working on my project, it appeared as if only more liberal, mainline Protestant congregations were declining. But now, as we are gathered here in this year, it's just amazing, 2019. The General Social Survey data just came out again. And what it's showing is that all forms of religious affiliation are declining. Conservative denominations, the Catholic Church, all different kinds of forms of Jewish community, and Protestant communities as well. And so what we've been through over this time period is a really interesting transformation of American religious life. Right now, the largest denomination of people in the United States is people who belong to no religious denomination. And since I work all the time with clergy and churches, and I have a degree in theology and church history, this makes me probably about as upset as it might make some of you if you are church leaders or denominational leaders. I don't find this news very happy. And here I was writing all these books about vibrant faith and vibrant communities, and one of the things I do know is that even in an overall situation of demographic decline, there are individual pockets of vitality in communities that are extraordinary and that are really finding their footing in these difficult days. But I have to confess, I got tired of leading retreats where all of the slides that I presented to people had lines that go down. And every time I would put up something about affiliation and that line would go down, I'd watch everybody in the congregation. I watched their faces go down, and I'd watch frowns start to happen. And I thought, I really can't stand this anymore. I want to actually find something that we can talk about that will, as my daughter used to say when she was a young teenager, Mommy, we need to turn that frown upside down. And so this project actually, on gratitude, actually emerged out of that. Is there a pathway to see the world differently? Rather than a time of decline and challenge and anger and despair, is there a different way of seeing things? And what are some of the stories we're not telling one another in these particular days? And for many different reasons, I fell on this as one of the stories we were really ignoring. Now, here's a chart, because I have to show a chart. Anybody who's ever seen me do a presentation knows that I was the queen of charts for about a decade in mainline Protestantism. I love charts. You can't really see that too much in the back, but you don't have to see all the details. I'll explain the outline of this to you so that you can understand what it says. This is from a survey that I've saw in November of 2015. The date is down here. And this particular chart showed up in the Washington Post, my hometown newspaper. And the Post, as you might imagine, what was going on here. They were putting out a survey on gratitude in November. So this is a little Thanksgiving story that showed up in the Post. This particular data comes from Pew Research Center. And over the years, Pew has done some enormous studies, I mean, enormous in terms of the number of respondents, looking at trends in religion, trying to understand what is really important to people right now. So they usually interview about 35,000 people for one of their surveys. That's how many people were included in this particular survey. And this was one question on a much larger survey. But the Post pulled out this one question for Thanksgiving season. And so the question here was, have you, in the last week, felt a strong sense of gratitude? November 2015, and then you can see the top line, 78% of us said, yes. In the last week, I have felt strongly grateful. All these different bars here just break out the question according to religious family, which could be very interesting to this particular group. The red are all Christian traditions. These rainbow stripes here are Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, and Hindu. And then these gray lines down here are atheist, agnostic, nothing in particular. I like that denomination right there. And the nothing in particulars are divided out between religion not being important to them and religion being important to them. And you can see that, wow, nobody's number here is less than 62%, and the numbers run as high as 89%. So we often think of ourselves in a time of great divide, where there's nothing that holds us together. But anybody here who works with data will know that it is very hard to get Americans to agree on any question on a survey like this over 65%. And yet, here's a survey that shows basically 8 out of 10 of us feel grateful on a regular basis. Yeah, that's kind of how I felt too. I heard somebody go, that's interesting. It was interesting to me for a number of different reasons. One is I was surprised by how high the number was. There are a lot of different ways of looking at that number. It could be that simply 78% of the people who answered this question wanted survey takers to believe that they had felt grateful in the week before. And it could be that people actually did feel grateful. We don't know how to sort through that, but what it does show is that gratitude has a certain, as sociologists like to call it, social desirability bias. That is, nobody likes to be seen as an ingrate, or at least most people don't like to be seen as an ingrate. And the second thing that sort of occurred to me is I sat back and I thought to myself, was I one of the 22% last week? I was thinking that I might not have felt as grateful as the rest of the people on the survey. And so that worried me a little bit. But it also fascinated me because I thought, well, here's a happy number. You know, whatever my own feelings are, here's a number that is so different than all of the numbers about religious decline that I usually look at. So maybe I should think about this. Maybe this would make an interesting book. What is it about gratitude? And is this something that can really, truly make a difference in the world? Well, back in November 2015, when I saw this survey and I was just beginning to think about writing a book about gratitude, I thought about how gratitude shows up in various places in my world. What do I know about gratitude? Well, I know a lot about gratitude from Oprah, because this is actually one of her favorite subjects. And I work all the time with mainline Protestant pastors. Whenever I put the picture of Oprah up, I get such a mixed sort of audience. Some people are just like, I'm worried about Oprah. It's like, I'm not. I love Oprah. And and I love watching her show. I love Super Soul Sunday. I love her magazine. I think she's been an amazing, engaging, life-giving presence all across the American cultural scene the last 20 or 30 years. And she loves talking about gratitude. Once a year, she does an issue that's like this of her magazine. And you can see this is a pretty typical, if you see the words gratitude on a magazine, this is a pretty typical headline. Gratitude attitude. I just got an email from the University of Virginia this week. They have been, I can't imagine why, running a campaign to raise money with the parents of UVA. In case you're not a basketball fan, you might not know that they won the national championship. And so the university decided this was a good time to hit the parents up for more cash. And so they ran their campaign, and lo and behold, today I got an email from the University of Virginia, and the headline in my email was, "An Attitude of Gratitude at UVA." And so that's something we see a lot of. What does that mean? But there it is. This was also an excellent issue. Oprah had interviewed Elie Wiesel about gratitude and his experience of the Holocaust. Very profound interview, probably one of the best interviews she's ever done in print. And it's an interview that I wind up quoting in my own book. So this is the kind of stuff that I knew about gratitude. It might be the kind of stuff you know about gratitude too. It's good, it's happy, Oprah likes it. You get emails about gratitude. And then I also knew not only was gratitude good, but it had come across my radar just enough that I was aware that somehow gratitude is good for us. And this is a headline from the Washington Post from February 19th, 2018. And pretty much any day in America, you can find some headline like this in some major news outlet. And the headline is, "Can gratitude help you recover from a heart attack?" What do you think the answer is? Yes, actually, it's a resounding yes. And it's not just a heart attack, but it is all kinds of other health crises. National Institutes of Health is doing research on this right now, the American Psychological Association. All kinds of different wellness and medical groups are exploring how gratitude functions with our physical well-being. First time I ever showed this particular slide, I was in Tucson, Arizona, in an Episcopal church. And It was a wonderful event. I put this up and I started talking about it, and in the congregation there was a man who was clearly in his mid-70s. He got very excited. He started waving his hand like this, and I'm going, I see that hand. Think about this. I'm in an Episcopal church. And and this guy's like waving his hand, and finally he hops up out of the pew, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And he literally interrupted. He said, I want to testify. And I said, sir, you're in the wrong denomination. And he said, no. Everybody laughed. And so anyway, he said, I was just at my cardiologist today. And my cardiologist said 3 things. Make sure I keep with my diet, continue my exercise, and start a gratitude journal. And so he was very excited that his own doctor had presented this kind of evidence now that is in medical journals and psychological journals about what it means to practice gratitude and how it's good for us. And so I always like saying, can gratitude help you recover from a heart attack? Yes, it can, unless you die. One of my friends says, but you'll die better if you're a grateful person. And I think that's probably true. So we have that. Gratitude is somehow good, and it is good for us, which is absolutely fantastic. The deeper I got into the project, all of a sudden, here I was, writing a book on gratitude, and I have a PhD in theology and church history. What do I know about gratitude? I mean, this was one of those moments where in my late 50s, I decided to launch into writing a book about which I knew absolutely nothing, which is it's kind of a fun thing to do. I think especially for so many of us when we're in our 50s and 60s, we're sort of afraid. We have our groove, you have what you're comfortable with, you have what you know. You kind of forget to break out of boxes. And yet this book made me want to jump beyond what was comfortable for me and learn about something entirely new. So all of a sudden, I find myself reading medical journals, psychological literature, philosophy that I was unfamiliar with. It was actually kind of a really fun exploration and an amazing kind of journey as a person and as an author to grow and allow myself to be able to see the world through some new lenses. One of the people I met along the way was a professor and I had no idea that this kind of thing existed. His name is Robert Emmons. He teaches at UC Davis. He's the professor of positive psychology at UC Davis. Now, I don't know about you all, but when I heard there was a field called positive psychology and you could get a PhD in it, I felt like I had missed my calling. I thought, what a happy and amazing thing that you could spend your life studying. And he is actually a really fine and remarkable man. He's one of the global scientific gurus, really, of gratitude. And so this is points that he makes in his presentations, which he is very happy to share with me. And every time I show this slide, I actually get so excited because even though it only looks like it's 4 really boring points, this is really interesting. It represents remarkable research about joy, happiness, healing, wellness, community, all kinds of things. So let me take you through these 4 points. He talks about the good of gratitude as well. And he says there are 4 major areas in which gratitude is good for us. The first is that gratitude allows celebration of the present. Now let that sink in for a minute. Gratitude is about the here and now. Since so many of you are from different religious traditions, you can think about things like what Scripture says. If you get your sort of mind too wrapped up in the past, I think you'll wind up a little bit like Lot's wife, you know? And we do that in our own lives, is that if you start looking too much backwards, you begin to live with regret and loss, and you think that whatever is back there is better than whatever is out there, and you sort of freeze. You can't go on. And if you think too much about the future, this is where I'm always texting my 21-year-old. She is like her mother. I was born with a furrowed brow, and so was she. And so she's always worried about everything. She's always worried about what the next thing is. I can remember when we were at Disneyland, when she was a little girl, 5 years old. We would just get off of a ride, and she would say, "What's next?" Instead of like, and I would really get frustrated with this sometimes. And I would look at her and I would say, "Can we just enjoy Cinderella's castle?" You know? But that's what, if you're always thinking about the future, that is an arena of worry, anticipation, fear, all these kinds of things. So thinking about the past, regret, nostalgia of a bad sort, the future, worry and anxiety. When we're grateful, we remember to be here. And I find that very powerful. Every morning these days I wake up and I at least say thank you. And no matter what the day is going to bring, no matter what my concerns are, no matter what my fears are, or what I wish I wouldn't have said yesterday, it is actually an amazingly lovely thing every morning to just say thank you. Because I'm alive. I'm alive today. I woke up. The sun is shining. The rain is pounding on the roof, whatever. I have this day. And so that's what gratitude does. It allows celebration of the present, and it helps to mute the anxieties of the other two. 2, gratitude blocks toxic emotions. Envy, resentment, regret, and depression, fear, all those kinds of things. And the way this works, I have found this point right here has become sort of my key to understanding the universe in 2019 and 2018, 2017, 2016. It probably works, it will work next year too during the presidential election. Take my word for it. And what the science around this point is very interesting. It involves neuroscience. And now I'm really not a brain doctor, but I love reading the popular versions of neuroscience. It's a little like reading the popular versions of astrophysics, you know. So scientists argue among themselves, but there's an interesting consensus that's growing in neuroscience, that different kinds of emotions are located in different parts of our brains. And these emotions up here, envy, resentment, regret, depression, fear, those kinds of emotions largely originate in the most primal parts of our brain, the oldest parts of our brain, which you sometimes hear people refer to as the reptilian brain. And so these old parts of our brain, they're old and important because they were evolutionarily significant for us as human beings. That is, our ancestors many generations ago needed fear in order to survive. If you're walking through a forest, you're trying to get dinner, and all of a sudden a big old beast pops out from behind a tree, one that you don't have enough of arrows to kill. If you don't feel fear, you might stand there and just think that he's being friendly. And of course, what that's going to do is you're going to get eaten. And so fear taught us as human beings to run away or to pick up a bigger rock or something and get away from the beast or kill the beast or climb a tree, something to that effect. So fear was evolutionarily advantageous to us. And other animals don't really feel that. Not all animals feel fear in that same way. That's why they wind up being lunch. And so we did not. And it was a good thing. Now, as we developed as a species, we began to live differently. And we gathered in towns and communities and then eventually cities and civilizations. And the human brain adapted to this. One of the things that we're finding out in the 21st century is that the human brain actually adapts to changes remarkably quickly. Right now, our brains are changing even as we're in this room because of the changes in the technologies all around us. And so human beings began to develop other kinds of capacities that worked for living together in community with other people. And so the front part of our brain began to develop, and that's where things reside, like compassion, empathy, and gratitude. And you can see why compassion, empathy, and gratitude would be good things to have if you're living very close together with other people in an urban environment. You don't need to be afraid of your neighbor. You need to be good to your neighbor. And so what this means in terms of point number 2 here is that neuroscientists are now discovering that people who have highly developed front neocortexes, more sort of bigger, better developed front brain capacities, like you practice gratitude, you're a deeply compassionate person, you share feelings with other people very easily, that those things actually block primal emotions from taking over your whole brain. So, if you feel afraid in a particular situation, and you're a person who practices gratitude on a regular basis, when the fear comes out of the primal brain, it actually bangs into gratitude, because the gratitude forms a kind of a screen, and it keeps fear from taking over your whole reactive system. And you now have a choice in how you behave. Gratitude gives you a moment to think about the situation you're in, to figure out if there are other kinds of options besides running away or shooting the beast. And it allows you to just, to live differently. You don't have to be afraid all the time. I don't know about you all, but this is, to me, fascinating, because so much of our political life right now is about ginning up fear. And so many people I know have literally just given over to this. And you know what? We do not have to. There are other ways of reacting. We do not have to live in fear. We can live with gratitude, empathy, and compassion. I think that this is amazing and really important. And it's not just in our political lives, but I made the little joke about my nice Methodist friends. My husband works in a Methodist church. They're an entire denomination right now that has been taken over by fear. And what happens is that institutions don't work when they are living in fear. Will the pension fund survive? Can we pay the bills for our buildings? What's going to happen to our seminaries? Will anybody ever come again to church? Can ministry continue to go on from this point on? I mean, think about what happens when fear takes over. And so gratitude stops that whole process just in its tracks, and opens up unforeseen possibilities of action. 3, these two are pretty easy. Grateful people are more stress resilient. Gratitude is not a magic bullet. It does not mean that if you're grateful, you're never going to feel stress again. Just like, a monk sitting on some rock somewhere. No, what it means is if stress comes at you, you have more of a capacity to put it in its place. And then finally, gratitude strengthens social ties and self-worth. Grateful people have more friends. So if you're a grateful person, congratulations. And grateful people are, and this is fantastic for this particular organization, grateful people are more committed to community, social services, philanthropy, caring for social sorts of goods, and all those sorts of things. Grateful people tend to give back more to society and deepen ties within community. So that is absolutely fantastic. If you think about this, and I got very excited about it. Here I was, I didn't know much about gratitude. All of a sudden I know a lot about it. And I'm thinking back to this particular slide. 78% of Americans feel a strong sense of gratitude on a weekly basis. Wow. Only 6% of us say that we seldom or never experience those feelings. And so when I see this, I guess that means that Americans are the most present-oriented, least toxically emotive, most stress-resilient, and deeply socially bounded people on the entire planet. Something is clearly wrong here. And I was so relieved when just a few days after seeing the first study, I saw this second study, also in November of 2015, that showed something else. And this study, which doesn't have a nice chart, I wish it had just a nice clean chart, but this is the cover page from the narrative study, is they were looking at the emotional complexity of the electorate going into the 2016 elections. And so Public Religion Research, doing this work, discovered that Americans were more anxious, nostalgic, which means looking to the past without any hope for the future. So that's how they're using nostalgic, so in a term of hopelessness, really, and mistrustful and divided than any other time that could be measured in this kind of survey material. And it's not just 2015, this is from just last week. A new survey shows that Americans are unhappier than, it says they, but hey, we, than we've been in years. This is a study done by the United Nations. They have a World Happiness Report. They do it every year. That's a nice thing too. I'd like to head up the World Happiness Report. And what they do is they rank nations on how happy they are around the globe. And this past year, the United States came out as the most unhappy developed nation in the world. Everybody was happier than us. The British were pretty low, but but they still beat us, even with Brexit. I mean, it was just like amazing. And so anyway, if you might see, if you're sitting up a little closer, it says there's a potentially surprising reason why. And the story goes on and talks about where one of the major issues of American unhappiness seems to be located, and that is around issues of addiction. And I don't know how much you know about addiction. I've had lots and lots and lots and lots of friends over the years who impart 12-step communities, and certainly I've had enough sort of time working with some of these issues in church communities, et cetera, to understand that addiction comes from some very interesting sources. Lack of self-worth, sometimes violence or abuse directed towards the person who winds up being the addict, and they have no other way of sort of feeling full or feeling fulfilled. It certainly comes from despair, like there's no hope, There's nothing for them other than the drink or the drug, that they want to escape the pain. When I thought about this, I thought, well, certainly, and this report talks about it, opioid addiction in the United States, talks about other kinds of drug addictions, it talks about alcohol addiction. But all you have to do is watch, say, the Learning Channel, TLC, on a regular basis. And TLC is almost like an entire network devoted to American addictions. You could see 600-Pound Life, which is people who have terrible food addictions. It actually winds up being kind of an interesting show, because the people who wind up in this position where they're hugely overweight often have terribly tragic and hopeless lives. And they're often people who come from communities of intense poverty, which I also think is sort of interesting. So you have that show, which shows food addictions, and then you have the Hoarders TV shows, which shows addictions to stuff. Maybe the Sister Wives is addictions to love, feeling like you have to get married to as many people as possible in order to have a full life. It's really kind of interesting if you think about the way that addiction is spread across American culture. Now, knowing a little bit about this, one of the other things I know from my friends who have always been part of 12-step groups is that gratitude is often the first antidote to addiction. A good friend of mine likes to tell the story of the first time she ever walked into an AA group. And somebody said to her, "What are you thankful for today?" And she said, "Absolutely effing nothing." And they said, "Have a seat. We're glad you're here." And she sat down, and sitting down in that circle began to be the beginning of her recovery. And she then testifies, and she does this in public all the time, about how gratitude saved her life. So this is fascinating, is that gratitude is something we say we have, but I do not see the evidence. As a matter of fact, when I look out and I kind of scan the horizon, I see a lot about gratitude, but I also see this. And that is the moment that I ask myself, well, what's going on here? And what I think is happening here is that we have what I call the gratitude gap. And this becomes the central point of my book, is that somehow we've privatized gratitude. That we think of it as a sort of a boutique, personal, spiritual practice. We might feel it on a kind of random, ad hoc basis, but it does not seem to have transferred from that private space into any kind of larger, communal, public celebration of abundance, blessings, appreciation, and the capacity to really live together with joy and to make community. So tonight I just want to suggest one of the ways to overcome the gratitude gap, and then we will talk about this more in the morning. But I think part of the problem is that we really don't understand gratitude. And this little piece is what I want to give you this evening, is that sometimes we say a word and we think that everybody else is using the word the same way we are. But once I got into this project, I realized I did not actually understand gratitude. And this was where I was getting tripped up. Let me show you this. Here we have a word cloud. You ask people, what do you think of when you think of the word gratitude? So this is a little different than the 78%, although it winds up kind of having a Hallmark card quality to it in the same way that Pew study does. And so here's the big word, gratitude, and the other words are what people replied: appreciation, acknowledgement, emotion, feeling, thanksgiving, grateful, gratefulness, recognition, thankfulness. Up there is the word kindness. On that whole wonderful pink word cloud of happiness, there are only two negative words, and those words are, you can probably see one of them, obligation. And then the second word is teeny tiny, and it's indebted, right there. Well, even though people like giving the positive words, it turns out we're sort of haunted by those two negative words. And that was one of the things that was tripping me up about gratitude. Is gratitude a really nice, rosy feeling when somebody gives me a gift? Or is it a duty that I have to perform out of a sense of obligation with the ghost of my mother hovering over me, reminding me to write the thank you note? Well, it turns out that many, many Americans actually are haunted by obligatory notions of gratitude. That gratitude is somehow a duty. How many times have you ever said something like this? If somebody gives you a gift, you say, I'm in your debt. Or, don't give me that because I don't want to owe you a debt of gratitude. How often do we give a gift? And then if someone doesn't do what we think they should do with the gift, we get angry at them. It happens a lot. I see it happening all the time, and all that work that I did with churches. I wish I had $1 for every time somebody told me the exact same story. And the story was about the biggest giver in the church who just, sort of seemed like they were infinitely generous and poured out all these gifts on the congregation. And as soon as the pastor wanted to bring in a guitar band, the big donor said, if you do that, I'm taking everything away. That's not a gift. That's actually what we call quid pro quo. I'll give you this if you do what I want. And we do this all the time. Consciously, unconsciously, we live in a world where we say things like there is no free lunch. We're always looking for the strings that are attached to every gift. I can even remember growing up with my grandmother who became a young woman during the Depression. She was a teenager during the Depression. And every Christmas, she and my mom would have the same argument. My mom would say about 6 weeks in advance of Christmas, Mom, what do you want? And my grandmother would say to my mother, I don't want anything. Because I don't want to be in anyone's debt. And then my mom would say, well, wait a second, you love giving us gifts. What does that mean? And my grandmother would just kind of sidestep the question. But gifts are really hard for us. Gifts are very hard for Americans because we like to work. We like to earn what we have. And when we give things away, we like our names on the stained glass windows. That is not the kind of gratitude that is really good for us. As a matter of fact, that is about debt. Right now, the millennial types, my kids among them, are talking a lot about debt and what it would be like to live in a debt-free world. I'd like to suggest to you that that is not just about free college, or as my daughter says, free college and free weed. Yeah, that's how sometimes we think about millennials. But it's not just about that. They're actually making this enormous sort of social statement that is quite beautiful, is that I've begun to read some of these books, is that they're imagining a world that's based on a gift economy instead of a quid pro quo debt economy. And what a gift economy is everybody giving gifts all the time and expecting that there is enough for everyone. You might think, oh, that's impossible, that can't be done. Recently, I was in Hawaii, which was lovely. The United Methodists of Hawaii had me come out and lead some educational events for their clergy. And I was in this one room, and if you've never done this, oh man, I highly recommend it. I love going to Hawaii for this reason. Hawaii is one of our most diverse states. And so here I was in a room of about 300 people. About a third were European background, Anglo-European white folk. About a third were Pacific Islanders, and about a third were people from other Asian countries. And there were a few African Americans in the room as well. And so that's the big three in Hawaii, is European background, Pacific Islander, and Asian, with other diversities that come into the mix as well, and smaller numbers. So here I was in this room, and they're very representative of their state. And we began talking about these things, and one of the people who was a Pacific Islander got up and he said, you know, I love hearing you talk about this because you're talking about the cultural conflicts we have around gratitude. And I said, yeah, we really are. And he said, did you know that Hawaii, that the original Hawaiian people, had an economy that was based around gifts? And I said, well, what do you mean? And then they went on to tell me that in ancient Hawaiian culture, which is not perfect, no culture is perfect, but this is one thing that they did in a very interesting way, is that there would be people who would be fishermen, there would be people who would be weavers, there would be people who would be mango pickers, there would be people who did other kinds of things in the villages. And what happened is, when you went out to fish, when you picked your mangoes, after you wove your mats, is that everybody would just take a little bit of whatever they needed. So your family needs 3 fish in order to have dinner. You take all the rest of the fish and you put them in a big pile in the middle of the town. And then the same thing with your mats or your cloth, and the same thing with your mangoes. And so you would go to those places and you'd pick, if you were a fisherman, you'd have your few fish, and then you'd go pick up a couple mangoes, and you could fully expect that there would be mangoes in the middle of the town because your neighbor had done what he or she was supposed to do, and then they left all their mangoes there. And the same thing would go for the clothing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so everyone gave, and everyone just took a few things that they needed. Sort of sounds a little like the Book of Acts. And so they were telling me that it was like that. And as soon as they told me, I realized what had happened between ancient Hawaiian, the Hawaiian culture and European culture when we ran into each other. Is that when the Europeans got there and saw piles of fish and mangoes in the middle of the village, and the villagers said, take what you need, exactly, the Europeans took everything. And they said, that's what we need it all. And because they were grateful, the Europeans who came said, oh, by the way, thank you. And then they walked off. And meanwhile, the Hawaiians are standing there going, wait a second, those guys just took all our stuff. And they forgot to leave their things in the village. What are we going to do with these people? So that was absolutely fascinating, because that was, people started realizing in the room that sort of in this deep place, there was this cultural conflict that they had never been able to name. And the conflict was around gifts and gratitude. And then the people who were from Japan and Korea and China, they said, oh my goodness, we never knew that. So they're sort of watching what is going on with the Pacific Islanders and the people from the European backgrounds. And they said, this is fascinating because our cultures are more like the European culture, with highly structured ideas of gifts and gratitude that are based around debt. And so it was one of the best theological conversations I've ever had. But that's how Europeans think about these things, and this is the culture that's kind of behind Western capitalism. And so here's a definition of debt from Webster's. Oops, excuse me. Debt is something, typically money, that is owed or due. And the first definition is the state of owing money. And look at what the second definition of debt is in Merriam-Webster's: a feeling of gratitude for service or favor. This is why I felt uncomfortable. Is that so often we describe gratitude as a transaction. And not just a transaction. It's an action that demands, doesn't request, demands an equal reaction. But it's also hierarchically assigned. Because whenever I start talking about gratitude, one of the things that people always think about is benefactors and beneficiaries. People who give gifts and people who receive gifts. And we always think that givers and benefactors are somehow superior in social status, in economic wealth, maybe even in moral benefit. And we think that givers are less than, or receivers, are less than. And so we talk about the undeserving poor. And we have transaction and hierarchy complicating our understandings of gratitude. This is why I wanted to kind of stay away from it. And I didn't just think about what was going on in ancient Hawaii, but I also thought about, I happen to live in Virginia. I happen to think about the 19th century South, a highly structured, hierarchical society where the people on the top demanded of the people on the bottom, who they happened to hold in slavery, gratitude. My PhD was in 19th century American history, and I have read enormous numbers of sermons leading up to the American Civil War, mostly from Southern pastors. And it's absolutely fascinating to see how many of them use gratitude as a justification for slavery. And would literally put in their sermons. Can you imagine hearing this from the pulpit of your Presbyterian church on a weekly basis? That it was the moral duty of the enslaved to thank their masters because the masters had given them work. Let's not say anything about not paying them for it, but they had given them work, that they had given them clothes. Let's not say anything about it being rags, that they'd given them a place to live. Sorry, it's a little hut with holes in it. And what was really fascinating was they had given them Christianity. And that, of course, was the greatest gift of all. And thus the enslaved people owed a debt of gratitude to the masters. That's one of the ways that gratitude has worked out in American history. It's a powerful part of our understandings about class and race. And I really wanted to say, oh my gosh, there's got to be a different way. There has to be a different structure. And so this is where I want to leave you tonight. There is a different structure. And that structure is one that is found in every one of the world's great religious and spiritual traditions. It's not a hierarchical structure. It's not a structure of debt and duty. God gives gifts. God demands absolutely nothing in return. Gifts are free. In all the world's great religious traditions, gifts are given by God or the gods without any expectation of return. Creation is a gift. Why did God give that gift? There was not even anybody around to say thank you. Just because that's the nature of God. God creates. It is a gift. God just throws gifts out into the cosmos. An endless stream of abundance coming from the very heart of God. Whether you're Jewish or you're Muslim or you're Buddhist or Hindu or Christian, all of our creation stories are exactly the same in that regard. Is that it is a crazy, wild creator who is just sending forth compassion, gratitude, empathy, and love into what becomes the universe. And those things themselves actually become the very building blocks of all of creation. Gifts without any expectation of return. Free gifts. And a careful reading of all of the religious texts from those traditions, you can see that gratitude is not depicted as a hierarchical kind of pyramid of power with debt and obligation attached to it, but instead the central vision of gratitude in all of these great traditions is of a table. An endless meal, a feast that goes on, a table at which you keep pulling up chairs and more chairs and more chairs and more chairs, and that there is always room for more people, and that there's always enough for everyone to be fed. That is not debt and duty gratitude. That is what I call in my book gift and response gratitude. Because when we understand that everything is a gift and that it is all for free all the time, and that the greatest things that are around us on a regular basis are these gifts that cannot be commodified, they cannot be controlled, they cannot be turned into partisan goods, they are just there. The air we breathe, the love we have, the children we care for, the laughter of the universe, all of those things, there is enough. Jesus said, I came to give you life abundant. The Beatitudes, blessed gifts are everywhere. And our response, oh my. Can I help pull up more chairs? Can I bake the bread and make sure that everyone can get fed? I want to run around the neighborhood and tell everybody. It's not a demand, it's not an obligation. It comes just out of the receiving of a gift. I can't believe you've given this. And so that's where I leave you tonight. It's one of the things that I learned along the way is that gratitude is indeed good. It is good for us. But it has to be the right kind of gratitude. And this is why I think so many people are a little skeptical about gratitude, because in our heart of hearts, we all know we have been victimized by obligatory kinds of gratitude. And we're suspicious of it as a spiritual practice because we have seen how it can be corrupted by hierarchies of control and power, and that it can be used against us, and that we can use it, sadly enough, against other people. But if we also understand that that is not the kind of vision of gratitude that is present in sacred text, that there is an alternative, that we move from transaction towards a table, then gratitude becomes a radical and subversive healing practice that undoes hierarchies of power, that undoes the power, the fear that someone is going to control us, or the fear of scarcity. I just think this is an amazing kind of journey to have been on. One of the writers that I read along the way Brother David Stendel-Rast, who is now 92, I think, Roman Catholic monk, has a wonderful TED Talk on gratitude. I highly recommend it for everyone. But in that talk, he says, if you're grateful, you're not fearful. If you're not fearful, you're not violent. If you're grateful, you live in a sense of abundance and not a sense of scarcity, and you know that there is enough. And then he goes on to say, if you're grateful, this undoes the power pyramid under which we live. And so tonight, welcome to the revolution. A revolution of gratitude, where gifts are abundant, grace is completely free. Isn't that what Martin Luther and Protestant reformers 500 years ago were saying, and all the greatest of the Catholic saints, Francis of Assisi, Hildegard of Bingen? Grace is free, 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 free. And so are we. Amen. I'm told there are a couple minutes we have for some questions. So I would be happy to address concerns, thoughts. Yes, please.
Two wonderments. In my mind, I think one of the greatest etiologies of our social unhappiness is the breakdown of community in the United States. And the other thing I want to say is, interestingly, the prefrontal cortex is also strengthened by meditation, prayer, and fasting.
Yes. Two sort of aspects of his comment, both of which were really good. One of the greatest sort of sources of social unhappiness is the breakdown of community. And that actually leads to an erosion of genuine gratitude, because gratitude always implies that people are in relationship with one another. There is no gratitude in isolation, which is really kind of an interesting thing. So gratitude is potentially a bridge back toward one another, which I think is a very interesting idea. I've been working with some local political candidates in Virginia about thinking what it might look like to start talking about a politics of gratitude, which is kind of a wonderful, amazing, energizing, imaginative idea. What would that be like? And then the second thing is that the gentleman here, what was your name? Bob. He was saying that prefrontal cortex is also strengthened by meditation and those kinds of practices, prayer, silence, etc. And so there is definitely a link between being able to live up here and things that you can actually do. And I have found myself in the last couple of years while I was working on this project, I do find myself meditating more. And I think that this is also one of the reasons why, for example, the work of someone like Richard Rohr has become so enormously popular. The Catholic Franciscan preacher from New Mexico who teaches in contemplative and contemplative prayer. And so he just had his big yearly conference, and it attracts thousands of people from all over the United States. And the real heart of what his work is about is contemplation. And that's absolutely linked to gratitude. So, great comment. Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
I'm a little troubled by the role of tragedy when it comes to gratitude.
Yes.
And also my own guilt for having so much compared to so many others.
He said that he's a little worried about the role of tragedy related to gratitude and also feeling a little bit of guilt. So you've got kind of two things going into that question. I was concerned for both of those too. When I started working on this book in early 2016, I literally asked myself the question, what in the world does the planet need with another gratitude book written by a privileged white lady? So I really kind of had to think about that. And what it made me understand is that my part of the job of entering into a conversation about privilege is by being vulnerable and recognizing the places in which even those of us who feel like we have much have actually very complicated often and pained lives. And so I knew that for a book about gratitude to have any kind of credibility in the world in which we currently live, that I had to share some stories about my own life that I had never shared before, that put me in a circle of what I might want to call, I don't know if suffering is the right word, but certainly a circle of shared humanity with others who might be struggling with gratitude because of their own tragedies. And so I tell the story very early on. It's in pages 35 through 39 of Grateful, about having been sexually abused by a relative when I was 14 years old. And I tell it in a way that is not graphic. And I have never, as a writer, ever told that story in print. And I had never told it in a room. I mean, my friends knew the story, and my family certainly did, but I'd never really told it in public. And so what I wanted to do was to alert my readers to the fact that I was not writing this book from a position where I had had any kind of perfect life. And even though, you can look at me and say, oh, well, she looks very middle class, she's a white person, she's an author, she's on television, she must be successful. I carry around some pretty big wounds. And those wounds for many, many years impeded me from really being able to experience gratitude. And so in the book, I deal with tragedy and suffering. And one of the writers that I was compelled by in thinking about this is a Roman Catholic sister from Canada by the name of Mary Jo Leddy. And she says that the mystery of, or that suffering compounds the beautiful mystery of gratitude. And I think that that's really true. If you look historically, it's often populations who have been the most oppressed who have the highest senses of genuine gratitude. Not when it's forced, like it's forced by the masters on enslaved people, but what's fascinating about 19th century slavery and that whole culture is that despite the fact that gratitude was used as an instrument of oppression by the people who were at the top of that social pyramid, the people who were on the bottom of that social pyramid took gratitude and turned it into a thread of being able to weave together the beloved community. Because what was happening here at the bottom of the pyramid is that the people on the top were trying to take away the humanity and the dignity of all of these people. But these people could wake up every morning and say, I am a man. I am a woman. I have life. No matter what the pyramid is saying to me, no matter what my status is according to the law, I stand with and in God and grace, and I have life. Thank you. And that becomes one of the deeply empowering parts of African American theology, the African American community, the fight against racism, all of these things that we have carried through time. So sometimes it's white people who have the worst time with thinking of gratitude and suffering, where it's the people who have suffered who are the ones who actually know that this is a path of tremendous dignity and empowerment. And so that's one of the things that I love about this subject, is it is very, it's subversive. It turns around the world that we usually think of. So that was what you're saying about tragedy. The other piece of that is guilt. Don't feel guilty. Jesus had a thing or two to say about that. Well, if you feel bad about it, give all you have to the poor. So, there's always great things to do if you feel guilty about having too much, and so don't feel guilty. Give it away. Do we have any women who have any questions, real quick? I'm just kind of looking. The women are often really a lot shyer about raising their hands. Okay, let me go over here. This gentleman, and then I'll move over here. Yeah.
Have you ever encountered when faith leaders are abused by their behaviors, their attitudes, and their compassion among the same research is evidence on that because the faith leaders have abused the power of God and take advantage. And that is from the gratitude of being given because we started not trusting.
Yes. He asked a question about what is the sort of the role of all this in faith communities where leaders have abused faith of the people who follow them, have abused privilege, etc. I don't know that there's a whole lot of research in this yet. We're all really living in the horror of this particular moment and trying to sort it all through. I do think that one of the things that often happens around religious leaders being able to gain power is that oftentimes they use spiritual practices like this in ways that they try to control other people. And so just from my experience as a woman and knowing other women who have been through such things in congregations, is that oftentimes sexual manipulation happens when a leader in a congregation tells someone who is in a subordinate position, a woman, maybe a child, or a young person perhaps, that they should be grateful because the person who is up here is somehow a conduit of God or God's giftedness, and that if you want to be really close to God, well, then you do what that person has to, what that person has to tell you to do. And after an abuse situation happens, oftentimes you do hear that abusers say things to victims, like, one day you're going to be grateful that I taught you this, yeah, really, Jesus. I don't even like saying it in a church. I feel like the roof's going to fall in. But the corruption and the abuse of gratitude often becomes a justification for very vile behaviors. And so that causes people, it breaks people's spirit, it breaks their faith up, it destroys congregations. It's a terrible, horrifying thing. And it often is then very, very, very difficult for victims to find their way toward other forms of community and genuine gratefulness because they've been so violated. So the research on that is yet to come out. I want to go to this woman who is right behind there and then go over here to this gentleman. Yes?
I was thinking about the idea of those who are so stuck in transaction that they often, I feel like, give just for that, just so that they can be thanked in return. And how do you combat that and get people into that idea of giving for the sake of giving? I mean, I think a lot of us have experienced people like that in churches, but also in family members, such as when you were talking earlier about that question about we've all been part of people who've been the obligation factor is like my entire in-laws, all of them, like a month after the wedding, wanting to know where's my thank you card.
Right. The question is, how do we help people break out of the transactional model that when they give something, they're going to get something in return? A lot of people have asked me that question, and my best answer for that question at this point is to get myself out of that model. And it is so subtle and devious in our culture. Here I am, I'm a writer. And one of the things that happens with authors is, and I'm sure you see this, you go into Barnes & Noble, you turn over the book, and on the back of the book, there are all these little blurbs where other authors, some of whom you may have read, say, oh, this is the greatest book ever, okay? Well, those little things on the back of those books, those are quid pro quos. And so what happens is, if somebody comes to you and says, would you blurb my book, you blurb the book, and then say the metaphorical you is me, I come back to that person and say, oh, by the way, I blurbed your book when it came out. I have a book coming out next year. Would you blurb my book? And then the person says no. And then I think to myself, well, I did that for you. You owe me a blurb. And that's, that's not as overt as a wedding present, but it is, this kind of transaction is just part of our workaday lives. It can happen in any kind of work situation. It's like, well, wait a second. I did this for you at work. Weren't you supposed to do X, Y, Z for me? Now, it could mean that the person that you did the favor for is just a really bad person and they're taking advantage of you and all that kind of stuff, in which case Jesus says, turn the other cheek. Or it could be that that person is just really terrifically busy and can't manage to, at this particular moment, return a sense of appreciation for that which you have done for that person. In which case, it becomes my responsibility to simply just let it go. Not hold it against them, not think, oh, they're a terrible person because they didn't do the same thing for me that I did for them. But instead, all right, I blurbed their book. Someone else will blurb mine. And so that's the piece of it that I always want to look at first, is where am I kind of misplaying this in my own life, and how can I do better? And my hope is always that as I do better, there's I'm modeling something better for the community that is immediately around me. So I hope. It's really hard. Authors are some of the most it's one of the most transactional professions that there is. It's just amazing how deeply it's built on quid pro quo. I hate that, because it should be built on the beauty of words floating into the world as just a free gift for all. That'd be lovely. Yes, last question, I think.
I saw a contemporary story that might go with your ancient Hawaiian practice.
Oh, good.
For many years, I worked as a chaplain in a large urban health center. And we had a very small chapel, we only seated about 20 people, but for no particular reason, we had a basket in the back. And there was always a few quarters in there, or a couple of bucks now and then. And our secretary of our department, the chaplain's department, would take it out about once a month. I don't even know what she did with it, really. But then our CEO, one day got this brilliant idea to build a box and call it Barnabas Box. And the money we would collect from there, we would give to the poor. So our carpenters built this beautiful walnut box. They had a little plaque on it, Barnabas Box. And lo and behold, about a week later, it got broken into. Somebody popped the lock. Then they rebuilt the box. Then it got broken into again. And I finally said, I know what's been going on all these years. Some people have been putting money into that basket, but other people have been taking it out. Let's just get rid of the box and put the basket back. Because I thought of all the families sitting vigilant in our hospital with their sick family members, they probably needed a meal in the cafeteria or something, So what? And there was, so that's what we did. We went back to the basket and just let some people give and some probably would take.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, I love that story. Thank you for sharing that. There are amazing stories about alternative sorts of economic and gratitude visions that are sort of all around us in our culture. I'll end with this one. Just a couple weeks ago, I was in Memphis, Tennessee, speaking at a big Episcopal church downtown. I lived in Memphis for a couple years, taught at Rhodes College when my daughter, at the time my daughter was born, so we lived there for 3 years. And when we lived there, at the edge of our neighborhood was this gigantic, deserted building. It was this old Sears warehouse distribution building that had been built in the 1920s And it is literally huge. It's like big enough for 3, 4, 5 football fields inside that building. And by the time we lived there in the late 90s, the building had been closed for almost a decade. You could kind of see where trees were growing up inside of the building. The roof was kind of falling in on one part. I mean, it was this huge wreck of a building, and it was also just attracting, all kinds of people who were drug addicts, and it was really sad. This time, when I went back there, a friend of mine said, "Oh, how long has it been since you've been in Memphis?" And I said, "It's been about a decade." And they said, "Oh, I want to take you someplace. I want to take you to the Sears building." And I said, "Please, no. What are you talking about?" And he said, "Do you know what's happened there?" And I said, "No, I have no idea." And being Memphis, what they were always doing was coming up with some failed plan to fix up the building, finding some developer, and then the developer coming, reneging on it. I mean, Memphis is just that kind of town. And what had happened was about 12 or so years ago, a fellow who's a Methodist minister who came to Memphis. He's a Methodist minister and a doctor. And so this is kind of in line with your story. He came to Memphis because he wanted to practice medicine in the poorest place he could figure out and give away medical care for free. Free gifts to poor people. And so for many of his first years in Memphis, he lived in complete poverty, but he had this sort of free medical clinic. It was called the Church Health Center. And it was in literally the basement of a Methodist church in Memphis. And it kind of caught on. People liked it. And so a couple different churches started supporting it. And by the time we lived there, it had a little tiny building, which was all by itself. But this guy, Scott is his name, he had a vision. And what he dreamed of is that you really could create an amazing community giving away health for free. And guess what is now in that Sears building? It's now a free hospital. But that's not all it is. Only one wing of it is the Church Health Center, which is actually a hospital that gives away top-notch services, because doctors over at like St. Jude's, which is another place that gives away free health care in Memphis, doctors at St. Jude's will come over and they'll participate. Doctors at the for-profit hospitals will come over and participate. So there's this one wing where they have just a free clinic for the poorest people in Memphis, operations, x-ray machines, health tests, everything. It's just amazing. But then the rest of the building, the other wing on the other side, is an art center that they have free space for painters and musicians, because this is Memphis, it's an arts town. And there's studio space for free. Above, when you come into, there's this huge courtyard where they've rented out space to small businesses, people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford rent in decent neighborhoods to start businesses. So there are little restaurants and a bookshop and a little clothing shop and all these kinds of things where people do mostly local food, local crafts. And then they had some of the best restaurants that I have been in Memphis. The food was absolutely fabulous. And one of the restaurants has opened a kitchen where they teach people how to cook for free. In the building, in the back, there's a space that's rented by the Jewish synagogue. They decided that they didn't need a freestanding building, but wouldn't it be great if you had a Jewish community that was actually practicing its faith within the context of the hospital and the arts and the little sort of pavilion of these amazing businesses. And then on the upper floors, there are 6 floors of apartments and condominiums that are all affordable, including one entire floor of the building that are apartments that are used by students who are on Teach for America in Memphis, where they can live for free during their 2-year teaching stints. And all of this all of this came from a guy who had a dream of free health care in the basement of a Methodist church. The whole building is restored. It is completely vibrant. Everything that happens in there is about community. It was the most socially diverse and racially diverse place I've ever seen people gathering in Memphis. It was full of music and color and light and people teaching and kids running around. And it's all basically for free. And what has, of course, happened is that some very, 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 very wealthy people in Memphis have decided to just give away everything in order to make this dream come true. And in giving away everything, they have created a world of great beauty and spiritual renewal that is open to the whole of the community. You know, we don't lift up stories like that. And it's like those kinds of beautiful things are happening all over America right now, where people know what gratitude really is and are pursuing a dream of a world where there is enough. Not a world of scarcity and division, but a world of abundance and community. And you know what? We can really do this together. And part of the reason why we think it's not possible is because we allow ourselves to be colonized by false notions of scarcity and indebtedness. And that's not what Jesus came for. Life abundant. And then there's that little thing in the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. So with that, I leave you with great hope, open imaginations, and hopefully hearts of gratitude. Thank you so much for being here tonight.